The idea of Indigenous Peoples Day was first proposed in 1977 by a delegation of Native nations to the United Nations sponsored International Conference on Discrimination Against Indigenous Populations in the Americas. And whereas, in an effort to reveal a more accurate historical record of the discovery of the United States of America, representatives from 120 indigenous nations at the First Continental Conference on 500 Years of Indian Resistance unanimously passed a resolution to transform second Monday of October into an occasion to recognize the contributions of indigenous people despite enormous efforts against native nations. And whereas Albuquerque has a strong history throughout the years of supporting the American Indian community and its citizens in advancement in our current society, and Albuquerque shall continue its efforts to promote the well-being and growth of Albuquerque's American Indian community and indigenous community. And whereas Albuquerque encourages businesses, organizations, and public entities to recognize Indigenous Peoples Day, which shall be used to reflect upon the ongoing struggles of Indigenous people on this land, and to celebrate the thriving culture and value that our Indigenous nations add to our city. Be it proclaimed that the Council, the governing body of the City of Albuquerque, hereby recognizes the second Monday of October as Indigenous Peoples Day. Mr. Estes.
Thank you, President Garduño. Albuquerque is the largest city in the state of New Mexico with the highest concentration of Native people living in it. And for President Garduño and the Council to consider this proclamation means a lot to this community, a community that is continuously marginalized and erased, not just within this city, but in the state as well. And by adopting this proclamation, the city of Albuquerque will join many cities across the nation, two actually today, that have adopted Indigenous Peoples Day, and that's Portland and Lawrence, Kansas. So it's also part of an international movement, as is described in this particular proclamation that began in 1977 with the inauguration of Indigenous Peoples. And currently, in the last 4 decades, that particular movement at the United Nations for Indigenous Peoples has addressed the issue of Indigenous Peoples Day in particular, and what does it mean for the world to recognize Indigenous peoples, and to begin telling the stories, the historic stories of contribution that Native people have made to the world, but also the contributions that Indigenous peoples have strived to achieve and are still striving to achieve. And so with this proclamation, it demonstrates a progressive step for Albuquerque, the city of Albuquerque, to begin humanizing Native people by honoring us on this historic day, a day that has been set aside by the United Nations, but has also been set aside by countless number of tribal nations across the Western Hemisphere. And so by adopting this proclamation, you will be honoring that commitment to Indigenous human rights and to the recognition of Indigenous peoples that currently call Albuquerque home. And so with that, I just want to conclude by saying that adopting the Indigenous Peoples Day as a formal day, the second holiday, or second Monday of October, is not going to end some of the marginalization that we experience as a community in the city or in the state, but it will be a progressive step forward for this city to begin thinking about and addressing histories that don't often get talked about, and voices, particularly Indigenous voices in this community, that often are marginalized. And so if by adopting this proclamation, we invite you, the City Council, to join us on October 12th, which is this coming Monday, for an Indigenous Peoples Day March that's going to be happening in the city. And it's booked to be the largest Indigenous Peoples Day March in the region, but also one of the largest gatherings of Native people in this city's recent history. And so I ask you to join us in making history. We recognize that Indigenous Peoples Day is not a parochial holiday. It's not just about Indigenous peoples. It's about talking and sharing. It's about talking about our shared history on this land. And so with that, I invite you to endorse this proclamation. The community that stands behind me right now, they're people who make your food, we teach your kids, we protect your kids. We work here in Albuquerque, we call Albuquerque home. And this is a proclamation that really came out of the local Native community here in Albuquerque, which, by the way, there are 291 federally recognized tribes that live in Albuquerque that currently call Albuquerque home. And so that's why we chose Indigenous Peoples Day, to represent the diversity of Native people in this city. So with that, again, I ask you to join us in making history, and in making history not just for this region and this city, but also making history with the rest of the world. Thank you. So we're planning to meet on First and Lomas, or no, First and Central at 5 p.m. right in front of Century Theater, and we've already met with the Albuquerque Police Department and several community organizations, which Ray has joined our coalition as well. So we invite you to come. Thanks.
Thank you. I am a resident of here in Albuquerque. I own a home. I also teach at the University of New Mexico, city councilors and their leaders. I just want to encourage you to accept this proclamation as a symbol and a recognition of the contribution that Indigenous peoples make to this country, to this state, and to this city. Thank you.
Thank you very much. At this point, well, thank you. Accept the proclamation. All of you can come up. I'd like to thank you too.